A seemingly ordinary dojo hides a shocking secret. Watch as an arrogant coach gets more than he bargained for when a true martial arts legend steps in. The lesson is unforgettable. Don't miss this epic transformation. Subscribe and like if you're ready for the ultimate showdown. Chuck Norris decided to return to form and visit a local dojo to get back into shape. It had been a while since he had trained regularly, and he knew that it was time to rekindle his passion for martial arts. He wasn't expecting much, just a quiet session to shake off the rust and remind himself of what he had accomplished in his prime. As he walked into the dojo, however, he noticed something that caught his attention. In the corner of the room, there was a mother, Riley Dawson, standing next to her daughter, Zoe. They were both new faces in the dojo, and their presence wasn't subtle. Riley, a strong and determined woman in her late 30s, looked like someone who was used to standing up for what she believed in, and Zoe, her daughter, had a soft but determined look in her eyes. The little girl, about 10 years old, was clearly nervous, but there was an unspoken resolve about her. Riley, as a mother, had decided to bring her daughter to karate lessons in hopes that it would help build her confidence and teach her how to stand up for herself. Zoe had been through her fair share of bullying at school, and Riley knew this was a way to help her learn how to defend not just her body, but her dignity as well. They were both nervous about the unfamiliar environment, but Riley was determined to give Zoe the opportunity to try. Chuck was observing them when they entered. He knew what this dojo represented, and he couldn't help but feel a connection to these two. As they walked past him, Zoe hesitated and caught Chuck's gaze. She didn't say anything, but there was something in her eyes that made him feel like he needed to watch over her. The quiet determination in her was not lost on him. Meanwhile, Coach Damon Cortez, the self-proclaimed Dragon, was setting up for the class. He was a man in his mid-40s, physically imposing with a reputation that made even the veterans in the dojo nervous. Coach Damon had a methodical approach to teaching, or rather a brutal one. He had earned his black belt through a combination of talent, intimidation, and sheer force of will. His reputation for toughening up students was unmatched, but it was clear to anyone with an eye for true mastery that his style was flawed. As the class began, Damon circled the room, barking orders and demanding precision. His voice boomed across the dojo, striking fear into even the more experienced students. Riley, watching her daughter struggle to follow the instructor's pace, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wasn't sure if this was the right place for Zoe, but it was too late to back out now. The lesson had begun, and there was no turning back. Damon called for Zoe to come forward, and she hesitated. Her small hands fumbled with her belt, and her knees were shaking. "What's your name, little one?" Damon asked in a voice that demanded obedience. Zoe barely managed to whisper, "Zoe Dawson, sir." "Speak up, girl," Damon barked, and Zoe's voice cracked with the effort to be heard. "Zoe Dawson, sir," she repeated, this time louder. "Better," Damon scoffed, not impressed, and gestured for her to join the rest of the students in the white belt line. As the class progressed, Zoe struggled to keep up. She stumbled during basic kicks and couldn't get her balance right. Damon didn't hide his displeasure. His voice rang out every time she faltered. "That's pathetic. A limp noodle could do better than that." He mocked her in front of the entire class, trying to assert his dominance. The other students shifted uncomfortably, some trying to suppress their laughter, while others looked away. But Zoe kept her head down, trying not to let the tears escape. She had never felt more humiliated in her life. Riley watched helplessly from the sidelines. Her heart was breaking as she saw her daughter struggle and be belittled by the instructor. But before she could speak up, Damon's voice cut through the air again. "What do you think you're doing here, Dawson? You think you're ready for this? Maybe ballet would suit you better." The words stung, and Riley stood up, her body trembling with a mix of anger and concern. She couldn't stand by and let her daughter be humiliated like this. She marched towards the mat, her voice unwavering despite the fear gripping her chest. "Coach Damon," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I understand discipline is important, but this isn't how you teach someone. You don't break them down to build them up." Damon's eyes narrowed and his lip curled into a sneer. "Oh? And what would you know about it, Miss Dawson? You think you can just walk in here and tell me how to run my dojo? If you don't like it, there's the door." Riley was taken aback for a moment, but then she squared her shoulders and locked eyes with him. "What you're doing isn't teaching, it's bullying. If this is how you lead, then maybe we should find another place." Before she could say more, Ethan, Zoe's young brother, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, can we go?" His voice was barely a whisper, but the sadness in it broke Riley's heart. Zoe, hearing her brother's plea, looked up at her mother, her face pale and filled with shame. Riley turned to her daughter and then back to Coach Damon. "We'll leave now," she said coldly, "but I'll make sure other parents know what kind of person you really are." With that, she turned to leave, Zoe trailing behind her. But before she could reach the door, a quiet voice came from the back of the room. "I think you should stay." The words were calm, yet carried a weight that immediately silenced the dojo. Riley turned to see the older man who had been observing the lesson from the back corner. Chuck Norris stood up and walked slowly toward the mat. "Excuse me?" Damon sneered, not recognizing the older man in casual clothes. "Do you have a problem with how I run things here?" Chuck didn't answer at first. He simply walked to the center of the room, standing tall in the midst of the tense silence. "I think you need to learn something," Chuck said finally, looking directly at Damon. "What do you think you're going to do about it, old man?" Damon laughed, his arrogance on full display. "You want to fight me? You think you're good enough?" Chuck Norris didn't flinch. "If you want to prove something, we can settle it right now. But if I win, you'll step down from running this dojo. And if I lose, I'll walk away quietly. No fuss." Damon laughed again, not taking Chuck seriously, but the challenge was set. The dojo was about to witness something neither side expected. The dojo fell silent as Chuck Norris stepped forward, his calm presence cutting through the tension like a knife. Coach Damon, still standing tall with his arrogance in full display, laughed dismissively at the challenge, clearly underestimating the older man. "You think you can take me down, old man?" he mocked, his voice full of scorn. "I've been teaching for years. You're just some guy who wants to prove something." His words echoed in the dojo, and a few students exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. Chuck didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, his stance relaxed but ready. His eyes were steady, focused entirely on Damon, and for a brief moment, the coach realized that this wasn't going to be a simple show of strength. There was something about Chuck's quiet confidence that made him uneasy, but he quickly brushed it off. This was his dojo, and no one, especially some old man, was going to make a fool of him. With a mocking grin, Damon lunged forward, aiming a powerful punch at Chuck's head. It was a move he used often in his classes, designed to overpower his opponents with sheer force. But Chuck was ready. His movements were fluid, effortless. He sidestepped the punch with barely a shift of his weight, letting Damon's momentum carry him forward. The coach stumbled, caught off guard by the older man's speed and precision. Chuck didn't waste any time. In a single, controlled movement, he grabbed Damon by the arm and twisted it, using the coach's own energy to throw him off balance. Damon crashed to the floor with a loud thud, his face reddening with a mixture of anger and surprise. The students watching were stunned into silence, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. This wasn't the fight they had expected to see. Damon quickly recovered, his pride stinging. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes narrowing with determination. "You got lucky," he growled, brushing the dirt off his gi. "Let's see how you handle this." His voice was filled with venom as he launched himself at Chuck once more, this time aiming for a low kick meant to sweep Chuck's legs from under him. But Chuck was ready. He easily dodged the kick, moving like water flowing around an obstacle, never rushing, never forcing. With a swift movement, he grabbed Damon's leg mid-sweep and redirected it, sending the coach tumbling once again. The room was completely silent now. Even the most seasoned students couldn't help but stare in awe. The younger instructors who had been taught to dominate through fear were now witnessing something entirely different. Chuck Norris wasn't just using strength. He was using mastery, discipline, and control, qualities they had never truly understood. Damon was visibly frustrated now, his arrogance slowly replaced by a growing sense of desperation. His breathing was heavier, sweat beginning to form on his brow. He had never been humiliated like this before. Every move he made seemed to be anticipated by Chuck, who wasn't even breaking a sweat. "What's the matter, Coach?" Chuck asked calmly, his voice carrying over the silence. "Can't keep up?" Damon roared, throwing himself at Chuck with a combination of punches and kicks, each faster and more furious than the last. But Chuck's movements were effortless. He flowed through each attack, using only what was necessary to neutralize the aggression. He wasn't trying to defeat Damon with force. He was outsmarting him, redirecting every attack with surgical precision. Finally, Chuck saw an opening. When Damon lunged in for a wide swing, Chuck stepped aside, grabbed his wrist, and in one fluid motion, locked his arm behind his back, pushing him to the ground once more. This time, Damon couldn't get up immediately. The pressure on his arm made it nearly impossible to move. He gasped, unable to believe that a man his age, who wasn't even wearing a gi, had outclassed him so thoroughly. Chuck stood over him, his expression calm. "I think we're done here," he said quietly. "You've learned nothing if you still believe that power is the only thing that matters. Real strength is in control, in teaching, in patience." Damon struggled beneath Chuck, his face turning pale with embarrassment. He had never felt so powerless. This man had shattered everything he had worked so hard to build, his reputation, his dojo, and his pride. But Chuck didn't push further. He simply let go of the hold, offering a hand to the coach. "If you want this dojo to mean something, you need to start with respect," Chuck said, his voice steady. "You need to teach your students that true strength comes from within, not from how hard you can hit or how many people you can dominate." Damon stayed on the floor for a moment, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't pride or anger. He felt doubt. The certainty he had always carried with him began to waver, replaced by the nagging realization that he had been wrong all along. He had built his dojo on fear, not on teaching, and now that foundation was crumbling. The room was silent, The only sound the heavy breathing of the coach as he struggled to regain his composure. He looked up at Chuck, who stood there without a trace of triumph in his expression, just a quiet understanding. "You're right," Damon admitted, his voice hoarse. "I've been teaching the wrong things. I've been focused on winning, not on making my students better." Chuck nodded once, his gaze steady. "It's never too late to change, but change begins with you." Damon slowly stood up, his movements shaky. He didn't offer his hand to Chuck. He didn't need to. The defeat he had just experienced was enough to teach him what he needed to know. As he looked around the dojo, the reality of his failure settled in. He had been a teacher, but he hadn't been a mentor. And now he would have to rebuild everything from the ground up. The students, who had been watching in stunned silence, began to stir. Some were still in disbelief, while others were starting to process what had just happened. They had come to learn martial arts, but they had just witnessed something far more important. A lesson in humility, strength, and respect. As Chuck turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back at Damon. "You've got this," he said, his voice calm. "But remember, being a teacher is about guiding others, not controlling them. Good luck, coach." And with that, Chuck Norris walked out of the dojo, leaving behind a changed man and a dojo that would never be the same again. The silence in the dojo was thick, filled with tension and disbelief. Coach Damon Cortez remained kneeling on the floor, his chest heaving with each breath as he tried to process the loss. It wasn't the physical pain that stung the most. It was the crushing realization that everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, had just crumbled before his eyes. His entire identity had been built on the premise that strength, domination, and fear were the keys to success. But in an instant, Chuck Norris had dismantled all of that, not with violence, but with controlled precision and undeniable mastery. Damon slowly rose to his feet, his face flushed with a mix of humiliation and fury. He didn't know whether to be angry at himself or at Chuck for making him look so foolish. But more than that, he felt a growing sense of confusion. The foundation of everything he had known, everything he had taught, was now in question. The dojo, once a place where he ruled with an iron fist, had suddenly turned into a space filled with quiet whispers. The students, still processing the spectacle they had just witnessed, exchanged uneasy glances. Some had witnessed his arrogance before, but never had they seen him so thoroughly humbled. Some of the parents, who had been watching from the sidelines, were still in shock. Mara, the receptionist, who had always seen Coach Damon as the face of the dojo, now stood at the desk, her arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of surprise and quiet satisfaction. She had always suspected that something about Damon's methods wasn't right, but it took a legend like Chuck Norris to prove it. Damon wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying to compose himself, but the sting of defeat was too fresh. He had never been in a situation like this. For years, he had prided himself on being the best, on teaching students how to be strong through intimidation and discipline. But now, with his pride shattered and his methods exposed, he didn't know where to go from here. He glanced around the dojo, at the faces of the students who had watched everything unfold. Some of them were still processing what they had seen, while others were beginning to quietly reflect on what it meant. Chuck Norris had left the dojo without another word, leaving behind a storm of emotions. Damon stood there for a few more moments, his thoughts racing. It wasn't just the loss that haunted him, it was the realization that Chuck had shown him something far more powerful than mere technique. Chuck had demonstrated the essence of true strength, patience, control, and humility. The lessons Damon had tried to teach his students through fear and force were nothing compared to the quiet power that Chuck had exhibited. Finally, Damon exhaled deeply, as if releasing the weight of his own pride. His gaze shifted to the students and parents who had now begun to stir. Some students, like Sensei Mark, stood near the back, watching him with a mix of respect and caution. Mark had always been loyal to him, but even now it was clear that the younger instructor was processing the event with a growing sense of realization. Damon turned slowly to face his class. His voice, which had once been authoritative and commanding, now carried a trace of uncertainty. "Everyone, take a seat," he said, his words softer than usual. "We're going to talk." The students moved slowly, unsure of what to expect. Some sat down, while others lingered near the edges of the room. Damon took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. He had to face them, had to explain the events that had just transpired. He had to address the truth that had been revealed in front of everyone. "I owe you all an apology," Damon began, his voice tight with emotion. "I've taught you to be strong, to dominate, to never show weakness. But today I learned that there is more to strength than power." He paused, looking at each student in turn. "What I've taught you isn't the whole truth. It's not enough to be strong on the outside. True strength is in here." He pointed to his chest. "It's in how we carry ourselves, how we treat others, and how we control our actions, not just our bodies. Today, Chuck showed me that." The room was silent as the students absorbed his words. Some of them nodded, understanding that this was a pivotal moment in their training. Others looked at Damon with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. It was clear that this wasn't just an apology. It was an admission of his own flaws, something Damon had never done before. "I've been wrong," Damon continued, his voice steadying. "I've been focused on power, on fear, on making you into warriors. But the real lesson is about teaching you to be better people first. The martial artist is defined not just by his ability to fight, but by his character. I've failed to teach that. I'm going to change that. But I need your help." The students looked at each other, their expressions ranging from cautious optimism to doubt. This was a different Coach Damon, one who had been humbled by defeat but was willing to learn from it. It was a moment of vulnerability from a man who had always tried to present himself as untouchable. As Damon stood there, feeling the weight of his own transformation, he glanced toward the back of the room. Sensei Mark was watching him closely, his arms folded across his chest, but his expression was no longer one of disbelief. It was something else, something like understanding. "I'll be taking a step back from teaching for a while," Damon said, his voice firm. "I need to work on myself, to become a better teacher, a better leader. I can't do this alone. I need to earn your trust again." The students were silent for a long moment, but then, one by one, they began to nod. They weren't sure what the future held, but they could see that this was a turning point. Coach Damon had been knocked down, but instead of fighting back with more arrogance and pride, he was trying to stand up in a new way, a way that involved humility and growth. Mark stepped forward, his face softening. "We'll work with you, Coach," he said, his voice steady. "We believe in you. We'll get through this together." Damon looked at Mark, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. I'll need your help." The dojo had changed in an instant. It wasn't just the defeat of a coach. It was the beginning of a transformation, both for Damon and for everyone in the room. And while the future was uncertain, one thing was clear. The true lesson of martial arts wasn't in the strength of the body, but in the strength of the spirit. And it was this lesson that would carry them all forward. As the class ended, the students began to gather their things, quietly discussing what had happened. Some left the dojo with their heads held high, while others walked away, contemplating the lessons of the day. But one thing was certain: this was a dojo that would never be the same again. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was for the better. Damon stood alone in the center of the mat for a moment, looking around at the empty dojo. It wasn't the place he had once ruled with dominance and fear. It was something more, something real, and he was finally ready to embrace it. Weeks passed since the day Chuck Norris had stepped into the dojo and changed everything. The air in the dojo felt different now. It was no longer thick with tension or fear. Instead, there was a sense of quiet anticipation. The students, still feeling the shock of the event, had begun to show signs of change themselves. There was a subtle shift in the way they interacted with each other, with more respect and patience, a stark contrast to the aggressive and competitive energy that had once filled the room. It was clear that Chuck's visit had left a lasting impact. Coach Damon Cortez, the self-proclaimed dragon, was different now too. He wasn't the same man who had strutted through the dojo, barking orders and belittling his students. The pride that once filled his chest had been replaced with a quiet humility. He had spent the past few weeks in deep reflection, working on himself both as a coach and as a person. He no longer saw his students as tools for his own validation, but as individuals with potential, each one deserving of respect and guidance. The change was gradual but evident. It wasn't easy for him. He had built his career on fear, intimidation, and the belief that strength came only from dominance. Letting go of that mentality was difficult, but Chuck had made him realize something crucial. True strength wasn't about breaking others down. It was about building them up. It wasn't about asserting your will. It was about teaching others to find their own strength, to rise above their fears, and to become better people. Damon knew that earning back his students' trust wouldn't be quick or simple. The damage had been done, and he had to show them that he was willing to change, that he was committed to becoming a better teacher. The first step in this process was the new approach he had adopted in his classes. He had started incorporating more positive reinforcement, offering constructive criticism instead of mockery. He made sure that every student knew that they were valued, no matter their skill level. One evening, as the sun set outside the dojo, the students gathered for another class. This time, there was a noticeable difference in their demeanor. The young students, who had once looked terrified of their coach, were now standing tall, their movements more confident. Some of them even exchanged smiles as they practiced. The atmosphere was calm, focused, and most importantly, respectful. The students weren't just trying to please their coach anymore. They were trying to improve for themselves. Damon stood at the front, watching his students with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. His posture was relaxed, and his expression, usually stern and unapproachable, was soft, almost thoughtful. He watched as Zoe, the little girl who had been humiliated so long ago, executed a roundhouse kick with precision. She wasn't the same shy girl who had stumbled on her first day. Now, she moved with purpose and grace. Her eyes caught his gaze for a brief moment, and she smiled. Damon nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of the progress she had made. It wasn't just her physical skills that had improved, it was her confidence. She had found her voice, and he had helped her discover it. After class, as the students bowed out and gathered their things, Damon called for a brief meeting. He had something important to say, something he had been meaning to share for a while. The students gathered around him, still uncertain but trusting. "I want to thank all of you," Damon began, his voice steady but soft, "for giving me the chance to change, for showing me that there's more to teaching than simply imparting techniques. You've all taught me something important. I've learned that a true coach doesn't just break you down to make you stronger. They build you up. They help you see your potential, even when you don't see it yourself." He paused for a moment, scanning the room to make sure his words were sinking in. "I've spent years teaching the wrong way, focusing on power and dominance. But I've learned that real strength comes from within, and it's about teaching you to find that strength in yourselves. I've been wrong, and for that, I'm sorry." The students were silent for a moment, processing his words. The transformation in Damon wasn't just in his methods, it was in his humility. He had acknowledged his past mistakes, and that was something they had never expected from him. Zoe, the same girl who had been humiliated so publicly, spoke up. "You've changed, Coach. You've made me believe in myself. I never thought I could do this, but now I know I can." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of the journey she had been on. Damon smiled, a real smile this time, not one forced by pride or ego. "Thank you, Zoe. You've all taught me just as much as I've taught you." As the class ended, the students slowly filtered out of the dojo. There was a new energy in the air, one of quiet confidence and mutual respect. Damon watched them leave, feeling a sense of accomplishment that was different from any he had felt before. It wasn't about being the best anymore. It was about helping others become the best versions of themselves. Later that evening, as Damon sat alone in his office reflecting on the day, his phone rang. He picked it up without thinking twice. "Hello?" "Coach," the voice on the other end said. It was Mark, the younger instructor. "I just wanted to let you know that I've noticed a real change in the dojo. The students, heck, even the parents, are starting to come around. They see what you're doing, and they're starting to trust you again." Damon leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation settling in. "Thank you, Mark. It means more than you know, but I've got a long way to go." "You've already taken the first step," Mark replied, "and that's the hardest one." Damon smiled, looking out the window at the quiet street outside. The dojo was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of growth, and for the first time in a long time, Damon felt like he was truly fulfilling his purpose as a coach. As he hung up the phone, he knew that this was only the beginning. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit or how many victories you can claim. It's about the strength to admit your mistakes, the strength to change, and the strength to teach others the same. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Weeks had passed since the shift in the dojo, and Coach Damon Cortez had become a different man, one who now focused on building his students up rather than tearing them down. The dojo, once filled with an oppressive atmosphere, now had a sense of calm, respect, and shared growth. The students no longer viewed their training as a battleground for dominance. Instead, they approached it as a journey toward self-improvement, discipline, and confidence. Zoe, who had been the most vulnerable at the beginning, was now one of the most determined students. She practiced diligently, her movements more fluid, her kicks more powerful, and her spirit far more confident than anyone could have imagined when she first walked through the doors. Her mother, Riley, watched proudly from the sidelines, noticing the change in her daughter. Zoe no longer flinched or looked down in shame during class. She stood tall and focused, ready to face whatever challenge came her way. Coach Damon had truly transformed, both as a teacher and as a person. His methods were now rooted in the principles Chuck Norris had shared with him: the importance of character, patience, humility, and self-control. He had moved away from his previous harsh approach, and his focus was now on positive reinforcement, guiding each student according to their individual needs. The dojo was becoming a place where students weren't afraid to fail. They were encouraged to learn from their mistakes and grow stronger because of them. But the change wasn't just internal for the students. It had affected everyone who came into the dojo, including the parents. Word had spread quickly about the new atmosphere in the dojo, and many parents had started bringing their children in, hopeful that their kids would be treated with respect, no matter their skill level. This shift wasn't just about better teaching methods. It was about creating a community where people felt valued and supported. Damon stood in the center of the dojo one evening, watching his students practice. He had always believed that his strength came from his dominance over others, but now he knew that true strength came from helping others realize their own potential. As he observed Zoe, now executing perfect forms with determination, he couldn't help but feel proud of her and proud of himself for being able to guide her. He had given her the tools to believe in herself, and she had taken them and run with them. That was what real teaching was about. The door to the dojo opened, and Riley walked in, her face glowing with pride as she watched her daughter practice. She approached Damon, her eyes full of gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you, Coach," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I never thought I'd see my daughter stand so tall, so confident. You've changed her life, and mine as well. I thought about pulling her out of here so many times before, but now I see the strength you've helped her find in herself." Damon smiled, a rare and genuine smile, his eyes softening. "It's not me, Riley. It's Zoe. She found that strength inside herself. I just helped her see it." Riley nodded, her eyes shining. "She tells me all the time now that she wants to be strong, not just in karate, but in life. I can see it in her. She believes in herself now, and that's more than I could have ever asked for." As the evening class came to an end, the students bowed out and gathered their things, chatting amongst themselves, a sense of camaraderie growing between them. It was a sight Damon never thought he'd see, a dojo filled with respect and genuine encouragement, rather than fear and competition. Later that night, Damon sat in his office, reflecting on the transformation he had undergone. It had taken a humbling experience for him to truly understand what it meant to be a coach, to be a mentor. He had been forced to confront his own ego and the damage his methods had caused. But now he realized he had the opportunity to build something real, a dojo where students weren't afraid to fail, where they could learn from their mistakes and grow stronger. His phone rang, and he picked it up without hesitation. It was Mark, his most trusted instructor. "Coach," Mark's voice came through the phone, sounding sincere. "I just wanted to say that I've seen a real difference in you. The students, everyone, they're starting to see it too. The change is real." Damon leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. "Thanks, Mark. I'm trying. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm getting there." Mark's voice softened. "I think you've already come a long way. Just look at the dojo now. It's not the same place it used to be, and that's because of you." Damon didn't know what to say at first. The praise felt strange, but not unwelcome. "I've been hard on myself for so long," he said, his tone thoughtful. I thought strength was about control, about being the toughest guy in the room. But now, I know it's about lifting others up. It's about helping them find their own strength. You figured it out, Coach, Mark replied, and the students are better for it. We all are. Damon ended the call, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this dojo so many years ago full of pride and arrogance. He had been broken down, humiliated, and rebuilt into someone stronger, not because of his physical strength, but because of his ability to change, to grow, and to learn from his mistakes. The next morning, Damon stood in front of the dojo, watching the students as they filed in for their morning practice. Zoe was already there, her GI crisp and clean, her posture proud. As she spotted him, she smiled and gave him a nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't just the physical training that had changed for her, it was the belief she had in herself that had shifted. She was no longer the timid girl who had walked into this dojo months ago. She was a martial artist in every sense of the word, confident in her skills and in her ability to face the challenges ahead. Damon smiled, watching as Zoe and the other students gathered around him, ready for another class. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would continue to guide them, to help them find their strength, just as he had learned to find his own. The dojo had been transformed, and it was only the beginning of something much bigger than any one individual. It was a place where people could come to grow, to learn, and to be their best selves. And Damon knew that as long as he remained humble and open to learning, this place would continue to grow too. As the students began their warm-up, Damon joined them on the mat, ready to teach, ready to learn, and ready to face whatever came next. This time, he was no longer leading from a place of ego. He was leading from a place of understanding and respect. And that, he realized, was the true strength of a teacher. The dojo had become a place of growth, not just for the students, but for the coach himself. And with each lesson learned, they all moved forward together.